Que caminho eles percorreram até então, onde eles estão arquivados e qual o estado de conservação desses rolos dentro das latas. O filme carrega a imagem, o movimento e o som. E quando ele atinge um estado muito grande de deterioração, isso é, ele vai perdendo a elasticidade, ele não vai passando mais nos equipamentos e fica impossível projetá-lo no cinema de novo. Então nós precisamos entrar com um processo de restauração. Resgatar a alma desse filme antigo é o ponto-chave na restauração. É passar todos esses detalhes do início ao fim do filme para o novo suporte. Então, nós daí temos um filme restaurado. Mas a restauração é um processo muito caro, exige muitas técnicas, pessoas especializadas, equipamentos, muitas vezes temos que construir os equipamentos. E para não chegar em níveis tão dramáticos da conservação cinematográfica, é importante pensar na política de preservação. Sobretudo aqui no Brasil, onde nós vivemos num clima tropical, quente e úmido, essa condição climática acelera o processo de envelhecimento do filme e faz com que a deterioração corra mais rápido, deteriorando o filme, pode ser chegando até a níveis impossíveis de recuperação. Vamos então acompanhar agora o documentário Salvadores de Imagem, onde vocês poderão conhecer um pouco mais da preservação cinematográfica.
The funny thing is, when I started out as an actor, I was on the stage, and there was this thing you had to accept about the stage, that you did the best you could, and sometimes there'd be something you felt was magical happening. But that was the last time it would be seen. It would just sort of disappear into the air, and you had to accept that. And I remember thinking, but if you do that on film, it lasts forever. And there was this thought that we had decades ago, that films did last forever. And now we're beginning to understand that first it turns green, then it breaks up into a little powder, and then it goes off into the air, just like the stage production did.
I think the irony is that film, in some way, is more fragile than any other medium. I mean, look at canvases of great paintings, hundreds and hundreds of years old, that we can still go and see. And motion picture film, which is so much newer, has had this sorry fate of being made up of an unstable element that causes it to, in some cases, just vanish.
Number one, it is, I think, the great American art form, the motion picture. Number two, it is a wildly important part of our heritage. And it is a record, not just of, quote, entertainment, but of mores, of styles, of fashion. It's just wonderful.
Listen, folks, it's a fact that I didn't write the letter.
Now you see, he admits that you're a fake John Doe.
For what you have done to all these good people, they ought to run you out of the country. And I hope they do it.
Speak up, John. We believe you.
Please, listen, folks. Now that he's through shooting over his face, I've got a couple of things to tell you about. And Ryan, bring this crowd out.
I'm sorry, folks, but we can't hear him anymore. Something's gone wrong.
On one hand, it's amazing how much survives. It just astounds me on a day-to-day basis. On the other hand, it also is, it kills me to think about how much we're losing and have lost. You know, this is really, this is our record of our century.
I think it's commonly believed, and I would subscribe to this, that the motion picture is, or moving images are, the best record of our times. They represent the clothes that we wore, the cars that we used. the house that we lived in, or what we put into the house. There is no other more thorough document of who we are than the motion picture.
My grandfather was one of the first exhibitors, and the exhibitor thought that at the last run, that was it.
Films were considered disposable assets. When the theater run was done, generally speaking, it was thought that there was no money to be made. They were destroyed.
It was like a razor blade. It was just a disposable item because nobody ever had any concept that they would ever be shown again.
On the whole, I think they just saw it as something very immediate and something that was, when done, as irrelevant as yesterday's newspaper, of course. Yesterday's newspaper isn't irrelevant either.
There's a fascinating part of an article from 1906, December the 1st, from a magazine called Views and Film Index. And it says, quote, "We often wonder where all the films that are made and used a few times go to, and the questions come up in our minds again and again. Are the manufacturers aware that they are making history? Do they realize that in 50 or 100 years, the films now being made will be curiosities? We observe especially important subjects such as President Roosevelt at gatherings, veterans' processions, scenes in busy streets, political meetings, and a host of other subjects too numerous to mention, all of which are of value to the present generation. But how much more so they will be to the men and women of the future."
Third Man, the first great contender for 1950's Academy Award.
I remember the first time I saw a 35mm nitrate print, and it absolutely knocked me out of my seat. The images seemed to almost glow on the screen. Absolutely glow. And I said to someone, why does it look so great? They said, well, it's the silver content in the film that gives it a slightly different cast and a different look. And I took note of that, and sure enough, when I saw it again in a newly made safety print, which had been very carefully made, it didn't look the same.
Nitrate also has the property of flammability. It quite frankly, is a close kin to gun cotton. One of the problems throughout history has been nitrate fires. We've had a number of catastrophic fires which have caused the loss of entire collections of films.
If you go way back into the early era, in the early 1900s, keep in mind there was no other markets for this film, and so they would take today's production and use it for tomorrow's pyrotechnics. They would actually use it and burn it, and that would become the fires for the next production.
Very few nitrate pictures from the teens era, the silent era, are said to exist today. You read figures anywhere from 80 to 90% of the films made during that period of time no longer exist in any form. We have records that they were made, we have scripts, we have press releases, we have reviews in newspapers of the day, so we know they were made, we know that what they were about, we just don't know what the films are, and we can't see the films any longer.
There's a lot of sad
stories about how people thought they had saved the films only to find that they had deteriorated because nitrate is very unstable. Even Harold Lloyd had these problems. He had a vault on his property and he had a fire. The heat caused the films to explode. The only thing that saved Harold Lloyd's films is that he had loaned out a good portion of his films to the Museum of Modern Art at that time. Otherwise, all his films might have been gone today. 90% of the silent films are gone. And the search goes on still today for silent films, and we're still striving to save as many as we can. Thank you, and welcome to the world's only silent movie theater.
When I first came to Los Angeles, there was a silent movie theater on Fairfax Avenue. And I used to ask my mother to take me there. So I would see these movies that were, by then, 20 years old, but for the last decade had been held in just low regard. Nobody paid any attention to them. So I was absolutely riveted by those films by Pola Negri and Valentino and Buster Keaton, primarily by Buster Keaton.
John Hampton opened this theater in 1942. Took him 2 years to build the theater. His love for silent films is what caused him to build the place. To him, the silent stars were idols. In that day and age, there was no interest really in saving silent films. It was old hack, so to speak. He used to chase down nitrate films and transfer them to safety films. And he had to use chemicals naturally to use this, and the chemicals were poisonous. They really didn't know about that day and age. And eventually it did cause his death from the chemicals. He actually devoted his whole life to the preservation and the showing of silent films. We felt by reopening the theater that all his work and devotion to the silent movies would be remembered and carried on. The people who made these films in the silent era, they were special. They had talent, ability, and a good mind, and look what they created. I feel that if we show their films, their footsteps in the sands of time are not forgotten, because they created something wonderful. And the likes of those people, we will never, ever see again.
I saw a 35mm film once. It was a safety print that had been copied from a nitrate that was deteriorating so badly. What happens is, first you see a blotchiness. It starts to creep into the sides of the film. And then it gets worse. And then it gets worse. And suddenly it's hard to read the title cards because these blotches are coming in and intruding on the titles. And then they're intruding on the action. It was such a tense experience. It's like your stomach was in knots, whether you were going to get through the film, whether the film would survive or not.
The one thing I have found is that nitrate is extremely unpredictable. Everything affects it. Everything affected it from the day it was made. We have films from 1894 that are in beautiful condition. On the other hand, we have films from 1950 and 51 that are about ready to go out. I mean, there's very little left of them. So there's just no way of telling.
Nitrate film, as does all film actually, have the seeds of its own destruction built in. It's a polymer. It was a plastic material that was made from acids. And some of that acid stays in the base as part of the final molecule. And eventually that acid literally starts to eat away at the film.
The film will start to bleach out on itself. You start losing the image. Eventually the film becomes sticky, but there would frequently be an image there.
Now this is so gooey, it's just like flypaper on both sides. And what I'm going to probably have to do is remove this one section in order to save the rest of this roll, because rotting nitrate is just like a virus. And once it begins in one spot, it just spreads until it destroys the entire roll of that and any other rolls in the can with it.
At sea, the horrors of war were heightened by the sinking of the Austrian warship St. Stephen.
There was a time when we got our moving image news not on television, we got it in the motion picture theater for half a century. In 15,000 theaters in the United States and thousands overseas, more than 40 million people every week got moving image news in what was called the newsreel.
Our theater was a tent set on the park on Sunday evening, and the whole town, all 400 of us, would flock to see these films. The newsreels would come on and keep us up to what had happened through the few months or the few weeks of the World War that was going on at that time.
The statistics are hard to come by, but I reckon that American cameramen alone photographed about 500 million feet of negative in those 55 years. Surprisingly, maybe as much as a third of that survives today. And of course, those of us who are concerned with archives and with the preservation of our heritage are very keen on preserving what remains. Like everything else in the early film, it was photographed on nitrate film. And as they say in the archive business, nitrate won't wait. Oh, they have tremendous emotional impact. Not merely the obvious things, the disasters, the war, and war is always emotional, and some of the footage that survives is heart-rendering. But also it is emotional in what it tells us about ordinary people. The accounts of the Depression years and the way we lived. The good times and the bad times, the celebrations, and the going to war and the coming home for war. Oh, they're filled with emotional impact.
Get it started, It's frightening, terrible. Oh my, get out of the way, please. It's burning and bursting into flames and it's falling on the mooring mast and all the folks between it. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, the place is 400 or 500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the frame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. Oh, the humanity.
O Brasil tem patrimônios naturais únicos, mas existe um patrimônio que não é obra da natureza e também é cheio de cor e vida. As festas brasileiras.
The industry was used to working with nitrate film, but it was actually quite dangerous. And so after World War II, Eastman Kodak and other manufacturers developed triacetate safety film. And gradually the industry completely switched over to that base. Safety film appeared to be a solution to the problems of nitrate. By copying all of our old nitrate films, or as many as we could afford to do anyway, on modern safety film, we'd be able to save these films for the indefinite future. It was quite a shock and a rude awakening after 20 or 30 years went by to discover that the safety films were also deteriorating, although in a different way. It's called vinegar syndrome kind of on an informal basis because as the acetate film starts to deteriorate, acetic acid is formed inside the can, and it has a strong vinegar odor when you open up the can.
Well, here's a good one. It smells just like your average salad bar. It looks normal, but from the odor you can tell that there's quite a bit of active deterioration happening inside the can.
It was shortly after I started working at the American Film Institute with David Shepard, and one of my first film expeditions was to go up to write a studio vault in New Jersey to sort of do a survey of the vaults. And before we left, a friend of David's gave us each a snakebite kit because the vaults were apparently crawling with poisonous snakes. We ended up not needing the snake bite kits, but I mean, I still have these visual memories of it, of some of the vaults had already exploded from summertime heat and deteriorating nitrate, and the shelves were just twisted, the doors were just hanging on a hinge, and not only that, the local kids used to climb over the fence, and they'd get into the vaults, and so there were cans all over, film flying all over the place, and we walked into one vault, and David points out to me, and he says, "Look, that's Citizen Kane."
You live forever on film. You have fans forever. They say, who was that? You know, I mean, Fred Astaire will live forever. We see Chaplin, we have Laurel and Hardy. They'll live on because of film preservation and for saving the film.
30 years ago, we did not have a preservation movement in this country. But there have been archives that have toiled for a long time, and longer than the AFI, the Museum of Modern Art, George Eastman House. And they have done superior work. Fortunately, they have been supplemented by other major archives around the country because it's too big a job for anyone to do.
The Museum of Modern Art in New York was organized around 1935, and they were in this field very, very early. They've been collecting films ever since the 1930s, and they've been preserving them ever since the 1950s. Another archive that's been around for quite a while is George Eastman House in Rochester. James Card, who was the curator there, had a large collection of silent films and used the basis of his collection to start their program. And they, of course, have been preserving films now for some time.
First thing I'd like to do is obviously welcome you to the Library of Congress Motion Picture Conservation Center. We're located, as you know, just outside of Dayton, Ohio. And this is the library's main film archive for nitrate motion picture films. The Library of Congress has the largest nitrate film collection in North America, if not the world. We have somewhere in the neighborhood of 120 million feet of nitrate film. 50 to 60 million feet has actually been at least copied, if not adequately preserved, but we still have a long way to go.
The Library of Congress, in a different sort of way, goes back further than anybody because their collection actually began in the earliest days of the movies in the 1890s and 1910s when film companies would copyright their films by sending them to the Library of Congress in the form of paper rolls.
What was registered was a series of paper prints, photographs, because there was no legislation, no copyright legislation which even mentioned the cinema before 1911. These paper prints were put away because they were treated as paper for a long time. One of the staff found them and said, good heavens, you know, these are, you know, really important.
This is an example of one of the Library of Congress's paper prints. So we can see as I unwind this here, we've got some leader on the front that helps protect the image. We actually have a photographic image on paper, a motion picture image on paper. It's even perforated, as you commonly see in film today. These paper prints have survived over the years primarily because they don't have acid deterioration problems like nitrate film does. We have roughly 3,000 of these in our collection. Approximately 200 have been remastered by us out here in Dayton with our new digitally controlled, computer-controlled printing system. We can do approximately 100 feet a day, so it's an ongoing process, a very tedious process, but one that's been very successful, and there's a lot of love involved in the duplication of these.
We've got the paper print mounted on the projector here, held fast in the gate, illuminated by these fiber optic lights. We've got our modified Mitchell camera here loaded with film. The one we're looking at right here is Admiral Sampson from the Spanish-American War returning to New York City and its harbor. By using the mouse, we can move the camera up, down, sideways, and then trip the shutter when we feel we have the best image. What's interesting about a lot of them is they are actual slices of life, political and just everyday life. You'll see some important dignitaries, William McKinley. You do see actual history in the making in a lot of these films.
Because there's no direct commercial value, it's not something you can release on a videotape and sell to the public. Chances are, if we don't do the preservation and the copying of those films, no one ever will, and they'll be lost. I like to think of Dayton, Ohio as the classic motion picture capital of the world. We have the negatives from all of the nitrate era features, or almost all of the nitrate era features. Casablanca, the Maltese Falcon, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. This is where it's at, folks, and this is where people get it.
I'd like to show you something down here. This is one of our real prizes. This is a truly, what would be considered a landmark film as far as history is concerned. This is the original camera negative of the Great Train Robbery. It was shot in 1903, and the negative is in beautiful condition. We are still able to make prints off it after 94 some years. Even though this film is in great shape and has been preserved and taken care of, we have many hundreds and hundreds of films that are not in that great shape, that are not as well known as this, that need the kind of care this one has gotten. Unfortunately, the money is just not out there.
It is the library's unique collection. We're responsible for it. The library has been mandated by Congress to be responsible to keep the American memory intact. We take that responsibility very seriously.
Well, back in the early 1970s, two film professors at UCLA learned that Paramount Studios didn't know what to do with their old library of nitrate prints of all the movies they made from 1929 through around 1949.
You won't hurt my legs, will you? My doctor says I have a very bad leg.
The doctor is off his nuts.
And basically, UCLA agreed to take this collection, and that was the beginning of our archives. We got about 800 or 900 Paramount feature films. Then, not long after that, 20th Century Fox similarly placed with us a large collection of their old nitrate prints, and then Warner Brothers, and then later Columbia and RKO. And shortly after getting these studio print collections, we actually got a very large collection, not only of prints, but of original camera negatives from Republic Pictures.
Let's go.
This includes a lot of great old movie serials, B-westerns, a lot of great films with John Wayne, Roy Rogers and Trigger and so on. And we've been preserving a lot of those films, of course, and ever since. In the middle of the 1920s, when sound came to the movies, many of the first talking pictures had sound not on the film itself, as we have it today, but on separate discs. These large 33 1/3 RPM, 16-inch size discs actually carried the music, the sound effects, and the dialogue and singing. The turntable mechanism was built into the projector in the projection booth, and he would place the record on the turntable and put the needle down at this arrow, which is the lead-in groove. They actually played from the center of the disc out to the edge. He would also thread the film with the word start in the picture gate. And then when he flipped the switch on, the motor would start to revolve, the turntable would turn, and the film would run, and it would be in perfect synchronism for a full 10 minutes until the end of the disc, when he would change over to the other machine. In order to put it back with the picture, we're going to be playing it on a special synchronous turntable, which synchronizes the speed of the disc exactly with 24 frames per second, which is what the picture film runs at. And we'll be putting it through some slight filtering and EQ in order to make it sound as good as possible, and then making a new optical soundtrack negative and making a new print of the film.
Over the years, unfortunately, the sound discs and the film became separated, so we have a large body of film for which we can't locate sound discs, and we have a large number of sound discs for which we can't locate films.
We have identified about 20 or so feature films and about 150 short subjects from this very early period, where both the discs that we have here at UCLA and the picture film, much of it at the Library of Congress, do match up. And so UCLA and the Library of Congress are working together to try to bring as many of these back together as possible.
Didn't movies always talk?
No, Judy. When I was your age, films were silent.
How do movies talk?
Well, running along the side of our film is the soundtrack.
I wonder whatever it looks like.
Well, we might ask the soundtrack to move in a bit.
Is that what makes the picture talk?
It's just a routine matter of technology.
Routine matter of technology, indeed.
If you think of sound recordings for motion pictures, and disregarding, perhaps to some archivists' dismay, the era of Vitaphone, in fact, sound recordings have always been made on motion picture film, photographed directly to the film. When the magnetic era came in the late 40s, early 50s, we weren't directly photographing the recording onto the film, but it was still a film base and a film carrier. So all of the questions or concerns that apply to the picture very much still apply to the soundtrack. This is 17.5 millimeter magnetic film, and it's very, very shrunken, and it's also deteriorating badly. That's what's causing the white powder. We have no idea whether it's going to work or not, but in fact, we'll give it a shot. Right now, it's transferring from this magnetic film into a computer, which then will be used to re-dump the material to other formats. A little Victor Herbert. This film is actually going through the machine rather cleanly, in spite of what you think by looking at it. And if you listen to the sound, you'll also hear that it's not wavering. Because of the way we've modified this machine, the chances of waver are very much reduced.
Hey, Tony. Hey. This is another one of those 60mm deteriorated films. It's a one-of-a-kind print. And it's obviously deteriorating, and it needs your magic touch.
What Tony is doing here at the Stanford Foundation Film Laboratory is trying to save as many rare early silent films as possible that in many cases survive only in 16mm. And he has set up a very excellent optical printer here that can copy these to 35mm film, which makes them look as good as they can possibly look.
Well, let's see how it runs.
For most films, particularly the really early ones, first you have to go through it physically and take care of all the splices that are falling apart. Many times there are tears and nicks in the edges of the film that need to be repaired with tape. You also need to see if the film's complete or not, of course, and go on a search to try to find, missing reels or missing scenes or better examples of certain shots, that sort of thing.
It's catching on the sprocket, so if it catches any more, we will need to change to a more shrunken sprocket set. I'm worried about the perfs if they catch on the top of the gate. There's some very thick splices. The idea is that you run until you have to stop.
The condition it's in, you're barely getting it through now, and if you couldn't do it, it might disappear forever.
I was just going to relate a few facts about Mr. Sun.
Facts? If you're going to tell my story, don't give the people equations and figures. Give them the real lowdown. Tell them what I mean to them. They've forgotten that.
Archivists tend to talk about nitrate film because it's obvious and because there is an absolute end point. The thing just disintegrates.
Furniture, cars, they're nylon.
But color fading, to me, is the really big problem.
It's sunshine. Tell them if it wasn't for me, they'd have no eyes. Because there'd be nothing to see.
That's enough. You're getting purple.
Particularly in the post-53 era, when you've got tri-pack film, fading for that first 10 or 15 years after 53 was terrible.
I was on a hiatus while we were shooting MASH, and I was in New York, and I just tuned into the local station to see what the show looked like. And I saw that the show was pale green. Everything was green. So I started calling around the studio, and I finally found an old man in a vault who sat with the film every day. This guy would know if the film was being protected. And he said, I'm so glad you called. They never did anything to protect the film. If it sits here a few more years, the image is going to disappear from the film.
Yes, it's a shame because, of course, there's nothing more exciting than that smash Technicolor. You know, in the musicals, when Fred Astaire and Ginger and, well, Rita Hayworth were dancing, you really saw their wonderful color hair and the beautiful costumes.
It's a sparkling story in a spectacular setting, filmed in glorious Technicolor.
Come on, I got another little surprise for you.
Oh, Norman, it's lovely.
So are you lovely. The whole world's lovely.
The color dyes in the color film that we use today have been stabilized considerably, but even so, color fading is a major problem for archives and studios who are trying to keep the color looking good for the future. The thing is that the dyes don't fade at the same rate, and this can change the overall color balance of the image to brown or purple or, in some cases, bluish. So what we have to do is to take this Eastman color negative and make a record of the three primary colors on black and white film, because silver images don't fade the way dye images do. So we take this Eastman color and we re-photograph it through a blue filter, a red filter, and a green filter on three separate strips of film. Interestingly enough, the old Technicolor 3-strip camera that was used in the 1930s and 40s produced 3 strips with the records that we need, the red, blue, and green records. And so these old Technicolor films, in that sense, are very, very well preserved. Unfortunately, they're on nitrate base, most of them, which is a problem. It's possible in the future to take these black and white strips and by shining the correct colored light back through them to convert them back into color again. And I have an example of it that I can show you here. We've printed the 3 black and white images using colored light onto modern color film to give us our 3 subtracted primary colors: yellow, blue-green or cyan, and red-blue or magenta. Now what I'm going to do is hold them together so that you can see how a full color picture emerges. First we'll put the yellow with the cyan, and then I'll try to hold, if I can, the magenta over that, and we'll see if we can get a full color picture.
Nothing is permanent, and everything will continually have to be transferred again. But that only makes sense if you can begin to think about it. It is expensive, but it is mandatory.
Remember, 30 years ago, if you looked in people's attics, if you looked in people's basements, if you looked in people's garages, that's where our American film history was lying.
People literally go through their grandparents' garages or cellars and find films and give us a call or give Museum of Modern Art a call.
I can't trust at the store. I was trusting in my soul. I'll be broke for 1 month more. Ho, ho, got the payday blues. Boom, boom, boom.
The race films, the black cast films made for theaters that catered to black audiences, for years and years were ignored, neglected. The wonderful thing about these black cast films is that in many cases they were produced and directed by black artists who were struggling to create their own vision on film.
Oh, Lord, as a poor pilgrim's sorrow, yes, Lord, tossed in this wide, wide world, with no hope for tomorrow. My poor wife has gone to that pure glory, and here I am, still walking in sin.
They were made with minimum amount of money. They had entertainment value for blacks.
And we didn't think they had entertainment value for whites. And of course, they weren't preserved either. And in my case, 3 of them were found laying in some place in a cellar in Tyler, covered up by a bunch of dirt, and I guess it had the proper temperature to keep it from disintegrating.
Come on, boys, hit leather. We're going to take a quick look at Mesa Canyon. Which is the quickest way, Slim?
Well, there ain't but one road, and it takes a bloodhound to find that. Specker better ride in with you.
Okay, come on.
I always loved the Black Cowboys. They remind me of the time that when we used to go to the movie and we had to sit up in the balcony and we couldn't go in the front door, we had to go upstairs, but we saw all the white cowboys. Then when a black cowboy came along, it was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. I was so excited.
Not a dime my jeans. I can't find pork and beans. Now I know what misery means. Oh, got to payday blues. Got to payday blues.
It's very sad to me to think about all the wonderful films that were made years ago that we will never be able to see again because they have been lost, destroyed, just misplaced.
There was a wonderful collection of material that was found in frozen tundra up in Canada. Both Canada and Alaska were the last sites to which films were sent by distributors in the early years. And oftentimes the films were not returned. It wasn't worth shipping them back from such a far distance. So you would pile up all of this footage, much of which was nitrate, and in one case they used it for landfill.
There was a swimming pool which wasn't used very much of the year simply because of the fact that it's cold in Dawson a lot. So they thought, let's turn the swimming pool into an ice rink. And they said, yeah, what are we going to do with the deep part? And they said, hey, all those films we've got, we're trying to figure out what to do with them. Let's get rid of them. So they filled in the deep end with all of the films, put some wood over them, dirt, and then it's left in there, and used it as a hockey rink. And then everybody forgot that the films were underground. So they weren't there to be brought back out, but they just used it so they could play hockey, right? Which is a good Canadian thing to do. Parks Canada was doing a restoration of the Dawson City historic site, and one of the buildings was being torn down.
As they began to dig down for a new foundation, they found a treasure trove, not only of news films, but of feature films, entertainment films, many of which had been lost or thought to be lost for years and years.
Because of all this material ending up in this one town, you end up with a snapshot of what a small town was seeing between about 1915 and the early 1920s.
I think one of the biggest problems that the public has in understanding what film preservation is all about is if you can see a film on TV, if you can go out and buy it, let alone rent it on videotape, what do you mean it hasn't been preserved?
Any of the electronic medium is not archival. There's a great misunderstanding in Hollywood about that. You can expect it to last 7 to 10 years, and you better be ready to transfer it to whatever the new technology is today.
What happens when those tapes disintegrate? What happens when a new higher definition format is invented, or a new way of projecting movies is invented, and you have to go back to your source material to create this new copy? What if there's no source material?
The film is the media of choice. It's got the highest resolution, it lasts the longest, it's an analog signal that's easy to reproduce, and that's the important thing. You shine a light through it, and you've got it.
A number of really significant movies exist only because one person saved a copy, and usually because they cared about it. It was something that meant something to them, and so they held on to it. And that's a remarkable thing, to think that they are the, without even realizing it, they are the keeper of this little piece of magic that otherwise wouldn't exist. When I first heard about John Harvey and told friends about it, they didn't believe it. What do you mean he has Cinerama in his house? Nobody could have Cinerama in their house. You'd have to break walls. You'd have to, create, windows for booths. Well, that's what he did. That is exactly what he did.
What used to be my living room is now a larger living room and contains these 3 projection booths necessary to house individual projectors for Cinerama. In redoing the house, I not only had to take out 2 bedrooms, but raise the ceiling so that I could have the shape and size of screen, that I could project properly the Cinerama process in the largest format I could. And that was very important to me because it had not been seen in America for years and years and years.
He squirreled away all this material, the equipment and the pieces of film that had to be built up again, foot by foot, to make even copies of all the different prints you need to show a Cinerama presentation. It's just amazing, just amazing.
I didn't want to have theater seats. I wanted to have living room type furniture. So I come up with the idea of having 2 matching couches, but elevating this couch in the rear, which I would call my balcony, since it's higher. Cinerama is a motion picture technique that was developed by Fred Waller that would incorporate a 3-eyed camera. The purpose for the 3 eyes was to see a peripheral view that, when displayed by 3 interlocked projectors on a deeply curved screen, they would reform the peripheral view that that camera saw the day the picture was taken and give you that feeling of being there. Well, it used to be quite a process to project the Cinerama system, and in the beginning, there were 5 people involved. There were 3 projectionists, 1 for each of the projectors, and a separate man for the sound reproducer. There was a 5th man that sat in front, astonishingly, of the center projection area with the audience. That man was in charge of synchronizing the projectors should they get out of sync. So I run the same job that those 5 men did, all by myself. Because I really don't want to have a friend that I trusted as a projectionist to help me come up and say, gee, John, I'm sorry, but I think I just damaged 20 feet of your vintage film. What do you do if it's a friend, Cinerama truly would launch the widescreen era that would come into Hollywood's use and help them be saved from a thing called black and white television. And because of that kind of importance out of the history of motion pictures, Cinerama needs to be something that's preserved forever.
Why would anybody do this? Well, he did it because he thought it was really great, and he wanted to save it. Not because he was the CEO of a corporation, not because he was an investor, not because he was a curator. He was none of those things. He was just an enthusiast. And so much of film history owes its very life to these enthusiasts.
Falling through space at 120 miles per hour, Bob loads and shoots beautiful Super 8 movies. The new camera is so small, it fits in the palm of your hand. So easy to use, Bob can slip it in a plastic bag and go right on shooting underwater. Wherever you go, you can capture all the color and beauty for your Super 8 projector.
Home movies, a lot of people don't take seriously. I think they think of endless kids' parties or tedious vacation footage. But when you think about it, they really are historical artifacts. They are made by people, everyday people of everyday life, and provide a view of society, of history, of their community, sort of in the making.
When we talk about saving movies, it's not just saving Hollywood movies that's important. It's all kinds of movies, newsreels, cartoons, TV commercials, industrial film, and home movies too, because they really are like a social history. What do people dress like? How did people act? What did it look like in the typical American backyard? Not the way Hollywood saw it, but a real backyard.
In the 20th century, film really has acted as a very unique form of recording history. And when you put it in the hands of everyday people, we get points of view and hidden histories, if you will, documentation that sort of fall through the cracks. Throughout the West Coast, Americans of Japanese ancestry were excluded from their homes and businesses and incarcerated in what has been called America's concentration camps during World War II. Although the cameras were considered contraband, there were some home movie cameras that were either snuck in or brought in, and they provide a very unique view of life in America that was not recorded and not documented by the mainstream media. I think that, you know, people should really begin with their own closets and their own experiences, and realize that what used to be just personal, private film is now maybe much more important. It now reflects a time and a period that is no more. It's really those small, invisible acts of human spirit that are captured on these home movies. And they really do remind us that we are all poets in that we live at all, and how important everyday people are to the making of history.
Preservation is something much more than a mechanical thing. Whatever someone cares about, he or she will be moved, be they a decent, wholesome human being, to try to do something to save it.
The greatest need in film preservation is simple: cash. That's the first and greatest need. And I think going along with that, hand in hand with that, is just promoting awareness. Telling people, talking to people, making others aware that this is something important, that it should matter to all of us.
For us to understand our past, in order for us to plan for our future, we have to understand how we are influenced by culture around us and by film in particular. And in this regard, film has to be preserved because it is one of the keys for understanding ourselves.
We haven't preserved as well as we should, but I think now we're on the road. I really think that we're aware that we do want to save the film, because that goes on and on forever.
Hello, Al. Hello, Milton. Men and women, in case you don't know him, I want to introduce the master of ceremonies of the evening, Mr. Al Jolson. Thanks. It is indeed a great pleasure and a great privilege to appear on this screen tonight to tell you one word of congratulation on the opening of this magnificent palace dedicated to the cinema arts. The recent scientific advances of Vitaphone have made